They say every story has a beginning and an end. But some stories, especially the ones written in blood, silence, and divine mystery, have a moment in the middle when everything breaks. A moment when the world shifts, when time seems to bend, when heaven and earth collide in a way that leaves a scar on history itself. And for Mary, the mother of Jesus, that moment happened on a hill outside Jerusalem, beneath a sky that should have been blue, but instead turned black. Most of us grew up with paintings of Calvary, soft colors, orderly crowds, gentle sadness. But the real scene was nothing like that. The air stank of sweat, dust, and blood. Soldiers barked orders. Flies gathered on open wounds. People pushed and shouted. And Mary, fragile, aging, trembling, walked into this chaos with a strength that modern poets still cannot put into words. She had watched her son mocked, spat on, beaten until his own friends could not recognize him. She had followed him through the streets as he stumbled under the weight of the cross. And now, standing beneath that instrument of death, she saw him hanging between two criminals, his breathing ragged, his skin torn, his eyes half open yet searching. No mother should ever have to watch her child die, much less die like this. But here is the part that most people never think about. Mary wasn't just grieving. She wasn't just mourning. She wasn't just watching the horror unfold. She was reliving every moment of his life, every lullaby whispered in the dark, every step he took in the dusty streets of Nazareth, every bruise she kissed, every lesson he learned sitting on her lap. She saw not only the broken man on the cross, but the bright-eyed child who once reached for her with hands full of wonder. She saw the Son of God, yes, but she also saw her baby. And in that moment, something inside her shattered. We tend to imagine Mary as peacefully composed, serene, graceful in her sorrow. But no painting has ever captured what truly happened inside her heart. Grief can be violent. It can tear through a person like fire. It can leave them gasping for breath. And Mary, holy, faithful, obedient Mary, felt that fire burning through every part of her. Yet she did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood. She stood when others fled. She stood when the apostles hid behind locked doors. She stood when the world mocked the man she had raised. She stood because that was her calling, not chosen by her, but chosen for her the moment she said, "Let it be done unto me." The cross did not break Mary. The cross revealed her. For as she looked at her dying son, Jesus looked back at her. And even in his agony, he saw her pain. He saw her loneliness. He saw her future. He saw the sword that Simeon had once prophesied would pierce her soul. And in one of the most intimate, heartbreaking moments in all of Scripture, he gave her a new mission. "Woman, behold your son." It was not simply a command. It was an unveiling. John was to care for her, but it meant more than that. Mary was being entrusted to the church. She was becoming mother not just to one disciple, but to every disciple, from the ones standing at the foot of the cross to the ones living centuries later, searching for God in a broken world. But for Mary, in that moment, all she knew was this: she was losing her son. She was losing the very heartbeat of her life. She was losing the child she had carried, nurtured, protected, loved. And soon she would lose his body too. When Jesus finally exhaled his last breath, something inside Mary died with him. The ground shook. The sky roared. and Mary felt as if the universe had been ripped open, because in a way it had. She might have collapsed if not for John's arms catching her, not because she lacked faith, but because she was human. She felt every ounce of this tragedy. She lived it fully, painfully, deeply. Saints do not float above suffering. They drown in it and somehow, through a grace we cannot comprehend, rise again. Later, when they took Jesus down from the cross, Mary touched his lifeless body. Her fingers shook as they brushed his matted hair, his bruised cheek, his torn hands. In the dimming light, she traced the wounds of the child she once held in a manger, and for the second time in her life, she held him in her arms. But this time, the miracle was not birth. This time, the miracle was endurance. Joseph of Arimathea offered the tomb. Nicodemus brought spices. They wrapped the body with trembling hands, and Mary followed them as they carried Jesus through the garden. Every step felt like a farewell. Every breath felt like breaking glass. The stone rolled into place with a heavy thud, final, cold, merciless. Mary pressed her hand against it, and in that moment, under the fading sun, the mother of Jesus stepped into the darkest silence she had ever known. Not because she doubted God, but because grief does not care about theology. It crashes through the soul like a storm, ripping up everything in its path. And Mary walked into that storm willingly. Yes, she believed in God. Yes, she trusted his plan. But belief does not erase pain, and trust does not replace a mother's tears. What makes Mary extraordinary is not that she understood everything. It's that she stayed in the grief, stayed in the silence, stayed in the ache, stayed in the mystery. She did not run from God when he became unrecognizable. She moved toward him. That night, when the disciples hid in fear and the world slept, Mary sat alone in the quiet, torn between memory and devastation. She replayed every moment of Jesus' life in her mind, the angel's announcement, the Bethlehem night, the wedding at Cana, the miracles, the laughter, the parables, the shadow of the cross creeping closer each year. And she wondered how any mother survives the death of her child. But that question would soon be answered. Not by an angel, not by a prophet, not by a vision, but by God himself. Before resurrection would break the darkness, Mary had to walk through the full weight of loss. Because resurrection is only understood by those who have stood in the shadow of death. And Mary, more than anyone else on earth, knew that shadow intimately. Her story, our story, was not ending. It was only entering its most mysterious chapter. And from the emptiness of that tomb, a new world was about to rise. If you want to journey deeper into this story, into Mary's resilience, her hidden life, her final years, and her astonishing legacy, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to continue creating powerful, meaningful videos like this one. Audience interaction question. Before you go, here's a thought-provoking question for you. Which part of Mary's experience at the cross moves you the most? A. Her unwavering strength as she stood at the foot of the cross. B. The moment Jesus entrusted her to John as the new mother of the church. Comment A or B below. Your answer helps the channel reach more people and builds a community of listeners exploring these powerful stories of faith. The morning after the crucifixion arrived quietly, not with the violence and trembling of the day before, but with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Jerusalem awakened to ordinary life again, yet for Mary the world had become unrecognizable. The streets she once walked with her son now felt hollow, missing the pulse of his presence. The city sang with distant noise, but everything she heard seemed muffled, as though grief had wrapped itself around her like a heavy cloak she could not remove. John remained by her side. True to Jesus' final words, he took her into his home, not as a guest, not as a duty, but as family. Mary stepped over the threshold of a house she had never entered before, carrying a sorrow that no household on earth was prepared to hold. Yet John welcomed her with a tenderness that reflected his love for Jesus, and Mary accepted his care because it was the last request her son had ever spoken on earth. But the house she entered was not one of immediate comfort. It was a place where memories of the last few days hung like smoke. Bottles of oil used to anoint the sick still sat in corners. Cups and plates that Jesus himself may have held only weeks earlier were placed neatly along the shelves. The disciples had gathered here before, laughing, learning, debating, praying. Now their footsteps were echoes of what once was. The room where they reclined together had become a sanctuary of silence, its emptiness broken only by the ragged breaths of those still grappling with the loss of their teacher. Mary looked around and felt the weight of their absence. She knew these men. She had fed some of them in Galilee, prayed for them, watched them grow under her son's guidance. And now they were scattered, hiding, grieving, trembling. She understood their fear, but she also knew fear had never been the end of any story God had written. For the first time in many years, Mary found herself unsure of her own place in the world. What does a mother do when her life's calling, raising the Son of God, has come to an end? Who is she when the role that once defined her identity is torn away? It is one thing to lose a child. It is another to lose him, knowing the world still needs him desperately. John spoke gently to her as he prepared a room for her. He did not attempt to comfort her with easy words. He didn't try to answer questions that heaven alone could answer. He simply remained close, offering presence when understanding was impossible. In grief, presence is sometimes the last anchor left. Mary sat on the mat John had laid out for her. She folded her hands, as she had always done when she prayed, but the words did not come. She tried to recall the hymns she once sang at the temple. She tried to whisper psalms. But the silence in her heart felt like a desert, vast and dry. Faith was not gone. It was only hidden beneath the ache of mourning. She knew grief could bury even the strongest conviction for a time. Yet she remained where she was. And sometimes remaining is its own kind of faith. Days passed with slow heaviness. Mary assisted in small tasks around the home, not because she felt strong enough to work, but because her hands needed something to do, while her heart tried to understand the mystery unfolding around her. She crushed grains for bread. She refilled lamps with olive oil. She swept the floor with slow, measured strokes. Each motion reminded her of life with Jesus. She remembered cleaning their home in Nazareth, watching him read from the scroll of Isaiah, hearing him laugh with his younger siblings. The memories felt both comforting and piercing, like touching the edge of a blade. John told her that some of the disciples had begun to return in secret. Peter, broken by shame. Thomas, wrestling with doubt. Others creeping through alleys at night, afraid that Rome's shadow still hunted them. They came slowly, cautiously, as people do when the world they relied on has collapsed. When they entered the house and saw Mary, they bowed their heads, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. She had lost more than any of them, and yet she was there, present, steady, a pillar of quiet strength among men who felt their souls slipping between their fingers. Mary listened as they recounted the events surrounding Jesus' arrest, how Judas betrayed him with a kiss, how soldiers dragged him through the night, how Peter denied him despite his vows of loyalty. Mary did not rebuke them. She did not accuse. Her grief had stripped away any desire to point fingers. She saw not failure, but frailty, the same frailty she had seen in humanity since Eden. In the evenings, John read aloud from the prophets. He read of the suffering servant, the one pierced for the sins of many. He read of the prophet Jonah, 3 days in the depths before rising again. He read from the Psalms, where David wrote of abandonment, followed by deliverance. And Mary listened, absorbing every word, her heart slowly shifting from despair into something more alive, more expectant. It was on the third day, when dawn spilled gold across the stone floors, that Mary heard a commotion outside the door. A hurried knock. Voices breathless with something beyond fear, something like wild hope. Mary rose from where she sat and moved toward the sound. When the door opened, she saw Mary Magdalene standing there, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with something Mary could not place. Not grief, not relief, something too large for language. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb," Magdalene whispered, "and we do not know where they have laid him." John and Peter rushed past her, running through the streets toward the garden. Magdalene followed. But Mary, Jesus' mother, did not run. She held on to the edge of the doorway, her fingers trembling. She closed her eyes. She knew something was happening. Something divine. Something that would change everything again. But she waited. The mother who had stayed beneath the cross now stayed again, her heart beating with slow, steady faith. Later, when John returned breathless, tears streaming down his face, he could barely speak. His voice broke as he said the words that would ripple through history. "The tomb is empty." The disciples stumbled through explanations. Mary listened to their shock, their awe, their confusion, and deep in her soul, deeper than memory, deeper than grief, deeper than sorrow, she felt something ignite. It was not surprise, it was not disbelief, it was recognition. She had known, even as she held his lifeless body, that death could not hold him. Not this son, not her son. When Jesus finally appeared to the disciples, when he showed his wounded hands and radiant presence, Mary was not said to be in the room, but some early believers believed she saw him privately, quietly, intimately, away from the others. Whether true or not, something in Mary changed from that moment forward. Resurrection became not a miracle, but a mission. Mary joined the newly forming community, small, frightened, uncertain, and yet glowing with a fire not of this world. She prayed with them. She encouraged them. She listened to their concerns. She steadied their trembling hearts. And without even realizing it, she became the quiet center of a movement that was about to transform the world. In those early days, they met in homes. gathering around simple meals, bread, wine, whispered prayers. But when Mary spoke, everything stilled. Her voice carried authority no one questioned, not because she demanded it, but because she had lived it. She had walked with Jesus longer than anyone. She had carried him, nurtured him, believed in him when the rest of the world scoffed. Her presence validated their mission. Her words steadied their resolve. Mary's grief did not fade overnight. Grief doesn't fade, it evolves. But resurrection gave her grief a new shape. No longer a wound that consumed her, but a scar that reminded her of divine love. She became the mother of a movement, the mother of believers, the spiritual anchor of the early church, and though Scripture goes silent on her story from this point forward, her influence only grew louder, shaping generations that would follow, shaping the faith of millions, shaping the soul of Christianity itself. Her life after Jesus' death was not a life of fading away. It was a life of rising, just as he did. The years after the resurrection unfolded quietly for Mary, not with the fiery drama of earlier days, but with a calm that felt almost supernatural, like sunlight resting on water after a storm. She remained at the center of the early Christian community, though she never sought attention. The disciples grew bolder, the message spread wider, and the world began to tilt toward something new. Yet Mary herself moved through life with a gentleness that belied the depth of her inner transformation. Her Son had conquered death, and in that triumph, something fundamental inside her had changed. She no longer viewed time the way others did. Every sunrise felt like a borrowed miracle. Every nightfall felt like a soft invitation toward eternity. As she aged, her presence became something sacred to the believers around her. John often remarked that simply entering the room where she prayed could steady his heart. Her voice, though soft, carried an authority no one challenged. Her hands, weathered from years of work, still possessed a quiet strength. And her eyes, those who knew her said they reflected something both familiar and otherworldly, as though she held memories of realms beyond the reach of earthly language. The community cared for her tenderly, but Mary remained remarkably independent. She woke before dawn for prayer, offering the same words she had whispered since childhood. She prepared meals when she could, comforted the grieving, listened to the troubled, and encouraged the young. But she was no longer the woman who once wandered Jerusalem in sorrow. Her grief had matured into wisdom. Her losses had fermented into something deeper than resignation, something like peace. Not the fragile peace that shatters under pressure, but the kind forged through suffering and sealed by hope. Over time, whispers circulated among the believers. Some said angels visited Mary in the night. Others believed she received visions of heavenly things, visions she rarely spoke of, though her silence only amplified the mystery. Even John sensed something shifting around her. He noticed that she sometimes paused in the middle of conversations, her attention drifting toward a presence he could not see. It was as though she lived on the threshold between two worlds, one foot still on earth, and the other stepping gently toward her Son's side. The first sign that her earthly journey was nearing its end came not through illness, but through an experience that felt more like revelation. Mary had gone to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, the same place where Jesus had surrendered himself to the Father's will. The trees had grown older since that night, their branches twisting upward like hands aching for heaven. Mary knelt at the base of one ancient olive tree, her breath steady, her heart quiet, and there, in the shadows and stillness, she felt a presence unmistakable and radiant. An angel appeared, not with thunder or brilliance that blinds, but with a gentleness befitting the woman who had welcomed God Himself into her womb. The messenger carried a palm branch glowing with a faint, warm light. Mary understood before the angel spoke. She had always understood the language of heaven, even before Gabriel first greeted her decades earlier. The angel told her that the time had come. In 3 days she would pass from this life into the next, not violently, not painfully, but as one who falls asleep after a long journey and awakens in a place more familiar than home itself. Mary's response was neither fear nor sorrow. It was gratitude. She had witnessed her son's suffering. She had lived through the world's cruelty. She had carried burdens few could imagine. Now she was being invited to rest, to cross into the kingdom her son had promised. The angel departed, leaving the palm branch as a sign, and Mary returned to John's home with a serenity that startled everyone who saw her. When she told John, his eyes filled with tears. For decades he had protected her, learned from her, leaned on her strength. The thought of losing her felt like losing the last living heartbeat that connected him directly to Jesus' childhood, his humanity, his earliest moments. But Mary embraced him, whispering that she was not leaving him, not truly. Love, she said, never dies. And the love God had woven between them would outlast even death. Word spread quickly through the community, and the apostles, many now scattered across distant regions, began to return. One by one they arrived at the house where Mary lay resting. Peter came first, weathered from years of ministry and persecution. He knelt beside her, unable to speak at first. She reached out her hand, and he pressed his forehead against it. They spoke for hours, not about doctrine or miracles or the mechanics of church leadership, but about Jesus, his laughter, his compassion, his childhood quirks, his final days. Peter left her room with a renewed tenderness in his heart. Others came. Andrew with his quiet humility, Matthew with his careful eyes, Philip with a trembling voice, and James with a heart heavy from shepherding the growing flock. Even those who had never known Jesus during his earthly life listened with awe, realizing they were in the presence of someone who had once cradled God in her arms. Mary did not speak grand theological statements. She simply told stories. She spoke of the night she first saw the star in the sky, of the smell of sawdust in Joseph's workshop, of Jesus' first steps on the dusty floor of their Nazareth home. She spoke of simple meals shared in laughter, of quiet evenings in prayer, of the gentle, compassionate boy who grew into the man who changed the world. Her stories stitched Jesus' divinity to his humanity, weaving both into something even the apostles had never fully understood. As the third day approached, Mary's strength began to fade, but her mind remained luminous. Her final hours were filled with prayer, not for herself, but for the world, for the church, for every soul who would one day hear her son's name. She prayed for courage for the apostles, for unity among believers, for peace in times of persecution. Her voice, though soft, carried a depth that felt like heaven echoing through clay. When the time came, she asked to be carried to a small room lit by oil lamps. The apostles gathered around her, singing psalms. The fragrance of spices drifted through the air. Mary lay peacefully, her hands folded over her chest, her breathing shallow but calm. She gazed upward, not at the ceiling, but at something beyond it, something only she could see. Some said they saw a glow fill the room in those final moments, gentle and warm like a sunrise. Others claimed they heard faint harmonies, as though distant choirs had descended to welcome her. John sat nearest her, holding her hand as her breathing slowed. Mary whispered one final prayer, a prayer of surrender, of trust, of love, and then she closed her eyes. Her passing was so serene, so quiet, that those present described it not as death, but as falling asleep. The early believers called it her dormition, her peaceful rest. But the story did not end there. The apostles prepared her body according to tradition, placing it in a tomb in the Garden of Gethsemane. They kept vigil through the night, praying, weeping, and reflecting on the enormity of what they had lost. Thomas, traveling from afar, did not arrive in time. When he reached the tomb the next day, grief overwhelmed him, and he asked to see her one last time. The others agreed, moved by his sorrow. They rolled away the stone, only to find the tomb empty. Mary's body was gone, leaving only the burial cloths behind. Silence fell over them, a silence filled not with fear, but with awe. Resurrection had once again touched the world. Jesus had risen by his own divine power, but Mary, his mother, had been carried, assumed, into his presence by the grace of the God she had served so faithfully. The apostles understood. Death had not claimed her. She had been lifted into the arms of her Son. In that moment, Mary's earthly story closed, but her heavenly story, one that would shape continents, traditions, doctrines, art, prayer, and the hearts of billions, was only beginning. The empty tomb of Mary became a quiet secret whispered among the apostles, a mystery they carried with reverence and caution. They did not proclaim it loudly. How could they? The world had only just begun to grasp the miracle of Jesus' resurrection. To speak of his mother's assumption so soon would have stirred confusion, disbelief, and accusations of exaggeration. So the apostles held the memory close, letting it live silently within the early Christian community. But silence, as history always proves, is fertile soil for questions. And questions eventually give birth to stories, stories that trace their roots across continents, threading through the landscapes of Jerusalem and Ephesus like two paths leading toward different horizons, each claiming to be the final earthly chapter of Mary's life. The debate began not with conflict, but with devotion. Christians of the first centuries longed to know where Mary had spent her final years before her dormition. They wanted to stand where she had stood, pray where she had prayed, breathe the air she had breathed. They wanted connection, not to an idea, but to the woman whose faith had shaped the incarnation itself. And so two traditions emerged, rising from two ancient cities, Jerusalem, the cradle of the apostles, and Ephesus, the city where John would eventually shepherd believers. Both claimed Mary. Both offered a compelling testimony, and both, in their own way, carried truth. The Jerusalem tradition held the weight of familiarity. It was in Jerusalem that Mary had witnessed the crucifixion, joined the disciples in prayer, and seen the birth of the church. It was in Jerusalem that she had lived under John's protection. moving through the narrow stone streets that bore the echoes of her son's final footsteps. The earliest Christians believed she remained there, anchored to the city where the greatest mysteries of salvation had unfolded. Pilgrims began visiting a small site in the Kidron Valley, near the Garden of Gethsemane, just across from the Mount of Olives. There, carved into the hillside, stood a humble tomb long believed to be Mary's. In the 4th century, when Christianity emerged from the shadows of persecution, believers constructed a church above the tomb, honoring the place where her body had once rested before being assumed into heaven. The spot soon drew crowds of pilgrims, men and women walking dusty roads, singing hymns, and entering the dimly lit chamber with reverent awe. The emptiness of the tomb only strengthened the tradition. How fitting, they thought, that the woman who had given her flesh to the Son of God would not see corruption. How fitting that her resting place stood empty, mirroring the miracle of her Son's resurrection. The Jerusalem tradition grew in strength because it aligned with geography, scripture, and apostolic memory. Acts testified that Mary was in Jerusalem after the Ascension. John, who cared for her, ministered in Jerusalem extensively before traveling elsewhere, and the great councils of the early church, held in the Holy City, often referenced Mary in ways that implied her presence there had remained significant. For many, the question seemed settled. Mary lived, died, and was taken into heaven from Jerusalem. But tradition is rarely so simple, and the Christian story, rich with human longing and spiritual search, soon extended beyond the borders of Judea. Across the sea, in the bustling city of Ephesus, another tradition began to take shape, a tradition that would gain extraordinary influence. Ephesus was a city filled with spiritual hunger, philosophical curiosity, and cultural diversity. It was also the city where John eventually preached, wrote, and shepherded a thriving Christian community. If John lived in Ephesus, then it was natural to assume Mary lived there as well, for Jesus himself had entrusted her into John's care. Ancient writers spoke of John fleeing persecution in Jerusalem and settling in Asia Minor. Some early believers claimed he brought Mary with him, seeking safety and peace far from the political tensions of Jerusalem. And on a quiet mountainside near Ephesus, Mount Coressos, later called Nightingale Mountain, stood a small stone structure that would eventually become one of the most beloved Marian shrines in the world. The story of how the house was rediscovered centuries later only added to its mystique. A German nun, Anne Catherine Emmerich, bedridden and far from the Middle East, described vivid visions of Mary's final home. She saw its shape, its layout, the surrounding terrain. Her descriptions were so detailed that explorers followed them to Turkey and found a house matching her visions almost exactly. Beneath the ruins, archaeologists uncovered stone foundations dating back to the 1st century. The structure included features consistent with early Judeo-Christian worship practices. Nearby, a spring flowed with clear water, just as Emmerich had described. The pieces aligned with uncanny precision. The Catholic Church, careful and slow in its verification, eventually recognized the site as a place worthy of veneration. Popes visited, prayed, and blessed it, and millions of pilgrims walked the stone path to Mary's house, touched by its simplicity and serenity. Even local Muslims, who honor Mary as the mother of the prophet Jesus, visited the house, calling her Maryam Anna, Mother Mary. Yet, despite the appeal of this tradition, it raised a profound question. If Mary had been assumed into heaven from Jerusalem, could she also have lived and died in Ephesus? Could both traditions hold truth? Historians and theologians wrestled with the conflict. They debated travel patterns, apostolic movements, architectural evidence, and early liturgical references. The more they studied, the more the lines blurred. On one hand, Jerusalem offered the oldest written testimony. On the other, Ephesus offered archaeological hints and doctrinal connections to the Council of Ephesus, where Mary was formally proclaimed Theotokos, God-bearer. But beneath the layers of scholarship and argument lay something deeper, something profoundly human. Both cities remembered Mary because both had been shaped by her presence, directly or indirectly. Her influence did not end when she was assumed into heaven. It spread through the lives of the apostles, through the stories they told, through the communities they nurtured. Jerusalem offered the memory of Mary the Mother, Mother of Jesus, Mother of Sorrow, Mother of the early Church. Ephesus offered the memory of Mary the Teacher, Mary the source of wisdom, Mary the spiritual guide, Mary whose very life inspired theological reflection on the Incarnation. Some wondered whether Mary had lived in both places at different times. Perhaps she had begun her final years in Jerusalem, but later traveled with John to Ephesus, where she found peace away from the political turmoil that engulfed Judea. Others proposed that her tomb in Jerusalem had been a symbolic or temporary resting place, reflecting early Christian patterns rather than literal burial. Still, others believed that divine mysteries need not conform neatly to earthly logic. A woman who bore God in her womb was not confined to the limits of ordinary history. Faith, after all, allows for paradox. What mattered most to early Christians was not the precise location of Mary's final home, but the truth her legacy revealed. Whether she walked the hills of Jerusalem or the forests of Ephesus in her final days, she embodied a life fully surrendered to God. She became a living sanctuary, a vessel of purity, faith, courage, and obedience. And when she was taken into heaven, whether from one city or the other, her story transcended geography entirely. In the centuries that followed, the debate between Jerusalem and Ephesus deepened, not out of rivalry, but out of devotion. Pilgrims traveled to both sites, praying, weeping, lighting candles, and leaving their burdens behind. Jerusalem offered solemnity, a sense of stepping into the heart of salvation history. Ephesus offered intimacy, a sense of entering Mary's personal sanctuary. Modern scholars continue to analyze the question, measuring historical fragments against theological tradition. But ordinary believers, standing salt-stung by Mediterranean winds or shaded beneath ancient olive trees, rarely worry about which version is correct. What they seek is connection, the feeling that Mary is near, that she understands their sacrifices, their fears, their longing for peace. And perhaps that is the deeper truth behind the mystery. Mary's life after Jesus' death was never meant to be contained by a single city, a single region, or a single story. The world claimed her because heaven claimed her first. The early Christians felt her presence because the spirit of her Son moved through her memory, and the places she touched, whether physically or through apostolic teaching, became holy simply because her life had illuminated them. In the end, both Jerusalem and Ephesus stand as testaments not to contradiction, but to abundance. Two traditions, two landscapes, two communities, all carrying pieces of a woman whose earthly journey ended in quiet glory and whose heavenly role began with unimaginable radiance. Her home, perhaps, was not merely a physical place, but any heart willing to receive the message she carried, that God enters the world through humility, obedience, and love. And wherever that message takes root, Mary dwells there. Centuries passed, and yet the memory of Mary did not fade, as memories usually do, but grew like a seed planted in soil richer than anyone expected. As the church expanded from Jerusalem to Rome, from Ephesus to Alexandria, from Antioch to lands unknown, Mary's presence seemed to follow the believers wherever they went. She was remembered not simply as the mother of Jesus, but as a living embodiment of the gospel itself. A woman whose entire life declared, without a single boast, that God draws near to the lowly and lifts them beyond anything they could imagine. At first, the early Christians were hesitant to speak of her too boldly. They revered her, respected her, cherished her memory, but they feared misunderstanding. After all, the world around them worshipped goddesses and earthly queens. The apostles wanted no confusion. Christ alone was the Redeemer. Christ alone was the Savior. Christ alone was worthy of divine worship. Yet, as generations came and went, believers found themselves unable to speak of the Incarnation without also speaking of the woman through whom it came. They could not discuss the humility of God becoming flesh without acknowledging the humility of the girl who said yes. Her obedience had become a thread woven through the very fabric of salvation history, and so, slowly, prayerfully, and with deep discernment, the Church began to articulate what the heart had long understood. Mary's role was not accidental. It was intentional, divinely chosen, and eternally significant. In the 4th and 5th centuries, as great councils gathered to clarify the mysteries of Christ's nature, Mary emerged as a crucial figure. Debates flared, fiery, passionate, and deeply intellectual, about who Jesus truly was, fully God, fully man, or something in between. These were not academic questions. Entire communities were at risk. The very integrity of the gospel hung in the balance, and it was Mary, quiet Mary, hidden Mary, humble Mary, who became the key. The Council of Ephesus, held in the very city where tradition claimed she had lived her final years, declared her Theotokos, God-bearer. Not to glorify Mary beyond measure, but to protect the truth that Jesus was fully divine even in his infancy. If he was God from the moment of conception, then the woman who bore him bore not a prophet, not a demigod, but God himself in human flesh. This title, Theotokos, echoed across the ancient world like a bell ringing through time. And with it came a new clarity, a new appreciation, a new tenderness toward the woman who had shaped the earliest years of the Savior. Still, even as theology deepened, Mary's appeal to ordinary believers came from something far more intimate than doctrinal definitions. People saw her as someone who understood. Mary understood grief. She understood fear. She understood poverty, uncertainty, and the weight of being misunderstood. She understood what it meant to watch someone you love suffer. She understood surrender, and not passive resignation, but active trust, the kind that shakes the foundations of heaven and earth. For this reason, believers across generations began turning to her in prayer, not to replace God, but to seek the comfort of someone who knew God from the inside, who had carried him, raised him, followed him, and surrendered him back to the Father. They believed Mary could intercede, not because she was distant or exalted, but because she was deeply familiar with the human condition. Stories began to surface, stories of miracles, healings, visions, and answered prayers. Some were small, the kind whispered quietly at night. Others were astonishing, the kind that reshaped entire villages. And whether one believed each miracle literally or symbolically, the impact remained the same. Mary had become a source of hope for the weary, a mother for the abandoned, a guide for the lost. In medieval Europe, her influence blossomed across art, music, and poetry. Cathedrals dedicated to her rose toward the heavens, their arches lifting the human gaze upward, just as Mary's life had lifted the world's understanding of God. Choirs sang Ave Maria beneath stained glass windows depicting her life in radiant color. Artists painted her not only as the young mother of Bethlehem, but also as the wise woman who had walked through sorrow and emerged luminous with faith. Yet, for all the artistic grandeur, Mary's presence remained deeply personal. People prayed to her in barns, in fields, in small stone chapels and candlelit corners. Mothers prayed for their children. Widows prayed for strength. Sailors prayed for safe passage. Soldiers prayed for courage. And the marginalized, the poor, the enslaved, the forgotten, saw in her someone who understood their suffering. In Mary, they found solidarity and dignity. Her assumption into heaven became a symbol of what God desired for every human soul. Not decay, but transformation. Not oblivion, but glory. Her life and death pointed to the divine promise whispered through Scripture, that the lowly will be lifted, the humble exalted, the faithful rewarded with a peace that transcends human imagination. Mary's story continued to evolve as Christian theology matured. In the modern era, Pope Pius XIII would formally define the dogma of her assumption, recognizing not a new belief but one held consistently by believers for nearly 2 millennia, and still her influence expanded. In Latin America, she became a unifying figure, appearing under names like Our Lady of Guadalupe, Consolation of the Afflicted, and Star of the Sea. In Eastern Christianity, she was revered as the Panadia, the All-Holy, the one who made holiness accessible to all who sought God with sincerity. In Africa, she became a symbol of hope amid oppression. In Asia, her tenderness resonated with cultures that valued motherhood and sacrifice. Even among Christians who did not embrace Marian doctrines, respect for her life endured. Protestants admired her courage, her purity of heart, her unwavering obedience. Many preached sermons on her Magnificat, the revolutionary hymn in which she proclaimed that God would scatter the proud, lift up the humble, and fill the hungry with good things. Mary's voice echoed in pulpits across denominations, reminding believers that faith begins not with certainty, but with surrender. For American Christians in particular, Mary became a bridge between the ancient world and the modern search for meaning. Immigrants brought her images with them, statues wrapped in blankets, paintings tucked into suitcases, rosaries carried across oceans. They placed her near windows, above doorways, on nightstands, and beside hospital beds. In a country shaped by movement and reinvention, Mary offered a sense of continuity, a reminder that God's story is older and deeper than any single nation, yet intimately present in every human journey. Today, millions continue to find strength in her intercession. They pray the Rosary, meditate on her life, and seek her comfort in moments of uncertainty. For some, Mary is a mother they turn to when their own families falter. For others, she is a teacher who models humility, courage, and radical trust. And for many, she is simply a companion on the spiritual path, gentle, patient, and unwavering. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Mary is not found in doctrines, shrines, or miracles. It is found in the way her life continues to shape the lives of believers. Her story invites each of us to imagine what faith might look like if we, too, said yes. Yes to God's call. Yes to mystery. Yes to the unknown. She teaches that holiness is not perfection, but surrender. Not flawless execution, but willing participation in God's unfolding plan. Her life whispers a truth often forgotten in the noise of the modern world, that grace can enter the most ordinary places, a small village, a humble home, a quiet heart, and from there change the entire course of history. As we reflect on Mary's journey, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, from Calvary to the empty tomb of her Son, from her quiet life with John to her glorious Assumption, we see not just the story of a woman, but the story of humanity's potential when joined to God's love. Mary's life reveals what it means to be both fully human and fully surrendered. It reveals the dignity of simplicity, the power of compassion, and the beauty of steadfast hope. And if her presence continues to shape the world long after her earthly life ended, it is because she remains what she has always been, a mother, one who gathers the weary, prays for the broken, and points every searching soul toward the light of her Son. Her story does not end with her Assumption. It flows into every generation that seeks God with a humble heart. It lives in every prayer whispered through tears, in every act of forgiveness, in every moment of courage born from faith. Mary's legacy is not locked in the past. It lives here, now, in the quiet strength of believers around the world. A woman once hidden in a small village became the mother of salvation history, and through her life, her obedience, and her love, she continues to guide the hearts of millions toward the God who made himself small enough to be held in her arms.